Do you need a web application security solution that can improve your detection rate and enable easier remediation? Acunetics has a fully automated solution that can detect and report over 4,500 web vulnerabilities. Fast and scalable, it can scan thousands of pages without interruption, including HTML5, JavaScript, and single-page applications. Acunetics provides accuracy with the lowest false positives by combining black box and white box testing. For more information, visit acunetics.com/securityweekly.
Welcome back, everyone, for the application security news for the week of March 17th. A couple of quick announcements before we get started. First, register for our upcoming webcasts with Logarithm and Recorded Future by going to securityweekly.com/webcasts. That's plural, webcasts. If you have missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find them at securityweekly.com/on-demand. That is one word. Also, we just released our 2019 Security Weekly 25 Index Survey. Please go to securityweekly.com and click the survey link to help us understand who's evaluating, using, or formerly used any of the Security Weekly 25 companies. The results will be summarized and presented back to all responders in a private webcast coming to you in the near future. With that, Paul, it's kind of interesting that you're running a survey. I know that you always kind of give surveys a bit of a hard time, so I hope all of our listeners go and fill it out so that we can have a good representative sample. Otherwise, yes. I know that you're probably going to rage about it on the show.
Yes, having a good sample when you do a survey is very, very important. So yes,
even
please
if you
fill it out.
If you don't use any of them, but you want to go back and fill the survey to be like a representative of the people that just, you haven't picked up any of the stuff that is represented there. That's also still good data, right? Like that's something that we need to know.
Yep.
So the week's news has some interesting kind of headlines. I think one of the ones that I wanted to start with was the fact that in this case, companies, they've got Box to, share all sorts of good stuff between their internal users, and lo and behold, they've misconfigured it. Who knew? So this was an interesting story that was available on TechCrunch, where basically the settings for Box when you went to go and share, different, Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoints, all that other good stuff that people share, photos, etc. Well, needless to say, the links that were generated and kind of the way that these were actually shared out, didn't actually let you control kind of, exactly who had access to it, but it was more like, here's your secure link that's not super secure and actually is, now exposed. So I thought that was an interesting article. I think actually the link that I put in there the link that I have in here is correct. I started misreading one of the links that I was just clicking on here, Paul. But yeah, apparently this companies included that were affected by this include Apple, among others. Of course, there's Schneider Electric, Point Care, United Tissue Network for basically tissue donations. And I was just kind of like, Apple has got problems misconfiguring, internal data that they don't want shared. That surprised me, I think, more than anything, because they're super sensitive to that.
Well, yeah, and it's an age-old problem, right? It's from now somewhat older. I mean, we recognize that saying no could lead to bad things, but on many networks today for enterprise or maybe just enterprise businesses, some smaller ones too, they're restricting how you can share files, right? They're saying if you're going to share files with someone, you have to use this secure method. And there's 50 plus vendors that give you a more secure way to share files outside of the organization. I think the problem is no matter what you give people, they're going to say, well, that's a pain in the butt, or I need to just share this file with someone. So they go home or they're traveling somewhere and they're like, oh, I'm going to create a Box account and I'm going to share this file with someone, right? And while they can't do that from the corporate network, right, so many people are not on the corporate network anymore and can just share it out. Now, there are vendors trying to, Netscope is one trying to, and similar vendors trying to solve this problem, but you can't, it's hard to control, right? How do you control a home user, a user's home PC that they've created a Box account and now, they're sharing files out on it. So as is evidenced by this breach, we know it's happening. And it's just a very difficult thing for organizations to deal with, right? I mean, it kind of comes down to the Snowden leaks. Even the U.S. government can't keep tabs on, all of its files, and things eventually do leak. So I'm not sure the solution to this problem. Again, there's many different ways people are trying to solve it, but at the end of the day, yeah, now with technology, it's really easy for users to go create an account somewhere and share out files.
So it makes me wonder how this plays into the zero trust model, right? Because a lot of people are moving toward like that, Beyond Corp or zero trust networks and kind of moving in that direction where, okay, you no longer have to VPN in. It's all accessible, all online, everywhere, as long as you have the right access to the right things. And I feel like, in some ways, Box is trying to go in that direction, but at the same time, isn't as successful as they would like to be in terms of just kind of maybe it's the defaults of the way that the actual application is intended to work versus the way that people understand it to work, right? So maybe it's just a semantic issue of, hey, we've said that this thing is now publicly accessible to the users that you shared it with, but that also means that maybe it's also publicly accessible in general.
Well,
So
yeah, I mean, because all software can have bugs, right? So, well, it may
indeed.
be zero trust or authentication. I think you let the cat out of the bag with that one, Keith.
I think
Uh,
so. This is one of my two cats that has joined us for Kitten Security Weekly that you're
very
probably
nice.
now hearing her. This one is the louder one. She tends to be a little crazy, but um,
Yeah, I mean, it could be
it's
a flaw in the software, right? Like, oh, we have this great model in place for some level of authentication and authorization, but there's a bug in software and it leaks, right?
and I mean, just from reading this article, I get the feeling that this is probably more of like a UI UX problem. Like
Hmm.
they just didn't understand necessarily how much, sharing they were allowing for some of these files. And so people just said, oh, it says share. So I shared it. And they didn't realize it was like default is to share
With
everyone versus
everyone,
to
right?
share. Yeah. So that's again, UI UX is now at the core of some of these application security problems.
Agreed.
Speaking of which, especially like things lost in translation, I wanted to go to story number one under "If you build it, they will come" because it's talking about how GoDaddy, Apple, and Google have misissued over 1 million certificates using a 63-bit serial number instead of a 64-bit serial number. What I found interesting in reading this article is at least the headline is kind of, shock and awe. Oh my goodness, all these certificates are, now broken. Not the case. You don't have to like freak out about this. There's really, almost no chance of exploitation according to everyone that's reviewed this. But what was interesting to me is the actual open source EJBCA software package is basically the core of the misconfiguration. But by default, EJBCA generated certificates with a 64-bit serial number, but apparently the mandates are that those 64-bit serial numbers have at least one bit that is kind of fixed to keep it as a positive integer. And so it was really only using 63 bits of entropy instead of 64 bits of entropy as like the RFCs say it should use. Which is why people are like, oh my goodness, you suddenly have, one less bit of entropy, which by the way ends up being, something like 9 quintillion values, the difference between 2 to the 63rd versus 2 to the 64th,
Hmm.
which is a lot of values. Don't get me
Hmm.
wrong. Like, um, but I don't know, like the baseline requirements for publicly trusted certificates say that the minimum threshold for serial numbers must be no fewer than 64 bits of entropy. Okay, check. But in order to keep it positive with that space, you kind of need to, make sure that it doesn't go negative. So yeah, apparently they were expecting to use floating point numbers and they used ints. I don't know. But I thought that was funny.
Oops.
Yeah, right. So there you're going to probably see some new certificates getting passed around for, GoDaddy or Google or, any of the other providers that were hit with this, including Apple. So don't be surprised. And by the way, apparently they're according to kind of the standards, they're supposed to have this all done within 6 days or some such of when this was found out. But GoDaddy's like, nah. We'll get it done over the next 30 days because we can't generate that many certificates that quickly and get them all redistributed that fast.
Hmm.
So yeah. here we are. The two at the top of Bugs, Breaches, and More, I thought were kind of, interesting and sign of the times in a very sad sort of way. So the first one is an owner of a Make America Great Again friendly Yelp knockoff threatened to call the FBI on a security researcher who was telling them, hey, you're basically exposing all of your users' data via your API so that anyone can see who has registered for your service. And then they turned around and said, "Yeah, no, you're hacking us. Like, we're gonna call the FBI on you," and on and on and on. And in my mind, it's like it's 2019. Like, security researchers are gonna do research, and clearly, this person has never once ever interacted with a security researcher trying to tell them that their stuff is broken. I don't know, Paul. This to me, like, it feels like a dumpster fire that's been, itself lit on fire inside of another dumpster.
Yeah,
I
it's a
don't even know
great
where
way
to
to.
start.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. Yeah, I think.
But yeah, needless to say, yeah, people, if you have someone reporting to you that, your stuff is broken, no matter what kind of website you make or your political affiliation, you probably should just stop and say, thanks, we'll look into it. We're more than happy to fix our code, and just kind of accept the fact that someone's doing you a service as opposed to, trying to hack you and get all of your users and have these political motivated attacks, which
Right.
it really didn't seem to be the case according to the way this researcher reported it. So I don't know. I just thought
Yeah,
it was
and
over.
and apparently
Yeah.
people still don't understand the way to interact with security researchers. I feel like we've made a lot of great progress on that, but still, there's a lot more education that needs to be done.
Yeah, yeah, no kidding. And speaking of just kind of, more researchers doing researchy things, under Article 2 for Bugs, Breaches, and More, this was kind of scary and interesting all at once. It's out of Forbes. It was a Chinese data breach exposes what were cited as quote unquote breed ready status of almost 2 million women in China. And again, this is like yet more nested dumpster fires because, first of all, whoa, super sexist, not cool at all. Secondly, breed ready? What the hell are you talking about? And then thirdly, like databases of, people in China, somehow I'm not surprised. So this was just kind of a dumpster fire inside of a dumpster fire inside of a dumpster fire
Eh,
because it's just,
So was
ugh.
this like a Chinese company that was polling women in
Yeah.
China?
Yeah, effectively. So it was, in this case, a Dutch ethical hacker found a database. It was MongoDB open to the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And this came out the day after International Women's Day, of all timing, that had what looked to be a private database from a company in China that was basically monitoring women. And one of the interesting things that is cited in the article, or it talks about in the article, is as a result of the one child policy in China for some time to curb growth of their population, they're actually now at a really bad state where in the next 10 years, the number of women in China aged 23 to 30 will decrease by 40%, which of course would have a catastrophic decline in their birth rates. And so it looks like this company was trying to basically build a database of who all the women will be, and try to probably target them for some sort of, hey, get married, have children campaigns, probably run by propaganda from, I don't know, the government,
Right.
to make sure that they don't have this catastrophic, decline in just people. So I don't know exactly what the end use was, and I don't
Mm-hmm.
even begin to want to touch this with a 10-foot pole, other than to say, first of all, disgusting. Secondly, somehow not surprised that China has, a company or is itself the government doing this sort of thing, because they tend to use data for all sorts of things on their own citizenry in ways that are definitely not, approved of or encouraged in Western
Agreed.
countries.
Agreed. Yeah, this is just an extension, I think, of their policies in collecting this data for all
Right.
types of reasons. Right. I don't pretend to be an expert in Chinese politics and culture, but certainly you can see how they might use this data, or speculate as to how they might use the data. You can also speculate how they collected the data as well. Was this like did they do it by spying, or did they do it you have to fill out this survey kind of thing? It's all kind of weird.
My guess is, again, just given some of the history of the Chinese government's kind of collection of data. For example, there was a SenseNet's data breach of 2.5 million records last month on the ways in which the Chinese government was tracking the movements of Xinjiang province Muslims,
Mm-hmm.
and how they were gathering data on those individuals using things like their identification, their visual photograph, as well as, of course, things that are being picked up by surveillance cameras, right? So I can imagine that they're probably doing quite a bit of, hey, we're going to pick up your facial data, and then we're going to map it back to who you are, and then we're going to map it back to all of the other connectivity that we have around who you are. And I believe China is starting to pilot that whole it's like a personal score for the individual based on any number of factors about them, including, of course, do they have a job? What's their credit history like? And are they paying their bills? And all these things that China is trying to shape their behavior to the extreme. If anyone wants to know what surveillance looks like when it gets out of hand, they
Mm-hmm.
need look no further than some of these behaviors that are starting to take place. Um, and
Well,
that's just
and it's
ugh.
interesting. In another story you had in here, Keith, if you build it, there will come. Story number 3. There was a medical lab that had a fax server running Elasticsearch exposed to the internet, and like
Right.
tons of millions of people's health information was on a fax server, right?
The one thing I found really funny about this story was they cite that the data wasn't encrypted. In my mind, I was like, it's a fax. No,
Right, right,
like, no shit, is it not encrypted? It's a fax, right? It's meant to be read by people.
right.
And so, yeah, as I was reading this article, I was just like, okay, first of all, again, I understand people need to do business, but they exposed this thing to the internet, and the authentication was like it didn't exist when they were going ahead and sending this bit of data around. And of course, as you
Mm-hmm.
fax things, I imagine what they were doing is they were storing the data and then sending that data across to the other fax machine and then having it print out accordingly.
Right.
And so, yeah, yet again, it's a misconfiguration problem of someone stood something up. They didn't think that, okay, we're not going to have a problem with this. It's a fax. Who's going to intercept our fax? It's sent over the phone. Well, yeah, no. Fax machines are apparently no longer just fax machines. They're internet connected fax machines, not just phone connected fax machines. And that leads to a whole host of problems. Um, yeah, so I can only imagine the HIPAA violations that are going to come out of this
Right.
as this gets, investigated, because otherwise it is going to be a mess. So yeah, have fun, good luck, not fun to be those companies right now. But speaking of connected systems and people thinking about encryption and things of that nature, let's talk about story number 2 under if you build it they will come, which is DARPA is apparently building a $10 million open source secure voting system. What I found interesting about this, and this is both partly where my concerns come in, but also I'm somewhat excited about this. So they are bringing this to the DEF CON like election hacking village this year, and I think next year as well,
Mm-hmm.
to let hackers get some hands on it, as well as out to universities to get some more information. But what they're doing is they're effectively providing all of the guidance around how to build a secure voting system, but they themselves will not be providing that secure voting system out to the populace, right? They'll be making that available so that companies who build voting systems can take that and then build on top of it. And I think at this point, almost everybody who isn't using a paper ballot is thinking to themselves, well, what type of software are they going to build on top of my voting system data that's already like secured according to DARPA? And the question is, first of all, you'll never know. And secondly, like, yikes, I don't know that I want a connected or, voting system built by DARPA that could get then, not get shipped by DARPA, because at that point, what is all the additional software that these companies are throwing into it,
Yeah.
and what is it doing?
It could
Right.
totally undermine. Well, I think the positive thing I saw is that if it is open source, right? If we take something like this and we do make it open source, that obviously inherently doesn't make it more secure. It allows potentially people who understand security and secure software versus not secure software to look at it and report problems. However, as we've seen throughout history, that doesn't always happen, right?
Right.
And
Right.
having something that's open source, if you want it to be secure, you still need the product management aspect of that component, right? You can't just rely on the fact that it's open source, that it's going to be good software and secure software. There needs to be a team of people who are employed whose job it is to make sure that it functions correctly and that security issues are addressed. That, to me, speaks to having secure software. Whether it's open or not, I think is independent, right? Anyone can go write software, make it open source, and say, yeah, everyone can test it and make sure it's secure. But is that really going to happen? And how are you going to respond to those issues that are reported? You need a team built around it who is motivated and compensated to make sure that software is functioning and secure. So provided they do that, I'm okay with it. But then you brought up the point, well, this is more like a foundation that other people can build upon, which almost always goes wrong. So now what's their practices, right? So now you're worried about the open source foundation and whatever other software people are building on top of it and hardware, and make sure that the collection of that is secure, which is now much harder. In a positive light, I do, positive and negative, I guess, I look at it like encryption, right? Many of the encryption algorithms are completely open. You can go look at them. The design is open. The software that's implementing them, like OpenSSL, for example, right, is all open. That doesn't mean they don't have problems, of course. Sure, public scrutiny is one thing, but it's not the end-all, be-all for security, for sure. Having said that, the fact that they are open does help. However, if someone does find a flaw, they're going to report it or keep it to themselves. It depends on what's at stake.
That's a whole other host of problems.
Whole other problem is if someone does, let's say a nation state, another nation state outside the U.S. finds a problem with it, are they going to report it or are they going to exploit it for their own benefit? So there's always that as well.
I mean, on top of all of that, right?
I guess it's going to happen whether open source or commercial, though, right?
Fair enough, right? There's that, right? For one. The other side of that, Paul, is as well as much as you can make the technology work really great, and say it's solid all the way through, no matter if it's the independent company that has built this on top of the open source stuff that is released by DARPA. I almost feel like the problem is kind of back to a story that I think we talked about last week, that Rob Joyce at the NSA talked about kind of defending forward. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, no matter how secure the voting system is, if your populace isn't resilient to the influences of external entities such as state actors, to political jargon, their vote, it doesn't matter if the system is secure to make sure that their vote is counted the way that they voted, they will get influenced and vote the way that external parties want them to, as we've already seen talked about with the 2016 election, for example. And so it really is one of those kind of situations where I applaud DARPA for pursuing this, but at the same time, I think at this point we almost have to move beyond that and start to think about, okay, is our populace mentally resilient to or even equipped to handle the sort of influence campaigns that are starting to be run? And by the way, like, as I've been reading more of the age of surveillance capitalism, the truth is that they probably aren't, and that's mostly because businesses such as Facebook and Google make a lot of their money off of the ability to predict what individuals are going to do and to some extent influence those decisions that individuals make. So that nefarious actors such as states are deciding to now leverage that against populists like those in the United States is both not surprising, and at the same time, no matter how secure your technology is, it's not going to matter if people will vote based on the way that they're influenced, as opposed to using their mind or their ethics or their morals to really make those decisions for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, speaking of
politics, right? We got another story along those lines, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say Beto O'Rourke. So for those that may not have watched the United States 2018 election, so Beto O'Rourke is, I believe, a mayor of a town in Texas, and so he ran for the United States Senate against, gosh, I'm forgetting his name now. Can't recall. Anyway, so he ran in Texas against a senator who is a sitting senator and a Republican, and Beto ran as a Democrat. The interesting thing was both the national attention that Beto's campaign got, because he received quite a lot of money from external donors throughout the country to support his campaign. But more than that, just how close he came to actually winning because of kind of his stance in a number of political issues that in the state of Texas would otherwise normally be considered unpopular. But he did very well. As it turns out, though, a forthcoming book on the cult of the dead cow hacking collective or hacking group back in the 80s and 90s is forthcoming, and Beto agreed to be interviewed by the author after the 2018 election came to a close. And lo and behold, our kind of dearly beloved Beto O'Rourke, former Texas, in this case, it says former Texas congressman. So I didn't know if he was in Congress before and then ran for mayor and then ran for Senate. Was in fact a member of the cult of the dead cow as a teenager. I thought this was awesome, Paul.
I thought it was awesome too. I thought it was pretty cool. Yeah.
Hackers running for public office. Heck yes. Like someone that actually understands the technology that, is running the country. We need more of this.
Yeah. And I think what'll unfortunately be lost is how different the culture was back then. Right. Yeah. I think in a lot of the meaning of the word hacker, right, I think it carries too much of a kind of negative connotation, whereas we try to refer to it as the, bad actors, evil bad guys, evil bad people, whatever, evil actors, trying to make it as generic as possible, but draw the difference between someone who is breaking into computer systems with the intent to cause harm or commit a crime versus much of the curiosity that was more so back then, and not fueled by any criminal activity. And that's going to be unfortunately lost in mainstream media, right? And especially on opposing sides of political parties, they're going to try and paint very different pictures of this, and turn it into a negative, whereas the security community at large knows that back then especially, many of the CDC members or those affiliates were not committing crimes, right? And just doing it for curiosity. I think, there have been those that have been wrongly or otherwise been convicted or tried for criminal acts, but it was a different landscape back then too. The laws were largely untested and things like that. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, if the cover to this is any indication as to how at least the article is being painted, it's Beto O'Rourke, his picture with some ASCII art kind of overlaid, and of course the traditional dark black and hacker green. So yeah, but having read through the article, it's a good kind of collection on the state of what the cult of the dead cow was all about, and then actually at the very bottom. It does talk a little bit about the forthcoming book, I believe, due out this June on the cult of the dead cow by Joseph Menn, Menn, which is actually, recording this and other stories about kind of the hacker culture back in those, late 90s era. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I mean, in some ways, it's good that this is coming out now because I believe Beto O'Rourke has announced that he'll be running for president of the United States under the Democratic Party, along with a host of other individuals that are also running for that seat.
Sure.
So. Yeah, I mean, to some extent, if you look at politics, getting this out now, kind of airing your laundry early in the process means that people can't use it against you later. So
that's true.
Yeah, there's that. Speaking of kind of, getting the thing out of the bag now, I actually want to point people to the commit strip comic of the week, which is CSS everywhere. For those of you that don't know, CSS or cascading style sheets recently announced that they will be supporting trigonomic functions. And what that means is you won't have to use JavaScript for calculations of your CSS any further. You can do it all natively. Well, in this comic, they perhaps take it a bit far, but who knows? Maybe by 2035, we'll know if this actually comes to happen or not. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Until next week, remember to git commit, stay classy.